We're going to start with a reminder of the other two Pythagorean identities. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1 we used quite a bit in the last video, and in this video we are going to use the other two. So we've got tangent squared equals secant squared minus 1, and remember you can rearrange these. You can always move that 1 around. You can put the two trig functions on the same side like it is in the first one. And then our second one is cotangent squared equals cosecant squared minus 1. So starting with our first one, and this actually isn't factoring, this is just simply using that Pythagorean identity, tangent squared equals secant squared minus 1. This one we're going to factor using a difference of squares. So all of the factoring that you already know with more basic functions, we can still use that same factoring with trig functions. So you could think about this like y to the fourth minus z to the fourth. So when we would factor this, we would get y squared minus z squared, and then you have the same thing but the opposite sign, because when you factor a difference of squares, you want that middle term to disappear. So we would get y to the fourth plus y squared z squared minus y squared z squared, which would cancel, minus z to the fourth. So we're going to use this type of factoring with our trig functions. So we would have sine squared minus cosine squared, and then the same thing but opposite signs, sine squared plus cosine squared. Don't lose the x. We usually shortcut that when we talk about it, and as you saw, I almost lost my x when I was factoring. Using that first Pythagorean identity, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So really we have sine squared minus cosine squared, which is another difference of squares. So I can keep factoring. This becomes sine of x minus cosine times, same thing but opposite signs. Now it might not seem like we are simplifying our expression, but remember the purpose of factoring is to solve equations. So we will be getting to solving trig equations, but first we have to learn how to factor them. Next, this is a t-chart. I'm going to flip this around so it's in standard form. This is the same as cosine to the fourth minus 2 cosine squared plus 1. When it's in standard form, it's a little bit easier to see the relationship. So again, I'm going to rewrite this like a quadratic expression you might be more familiar with. So if we had something like n to the fourth minus 2n squared plus 1, we would use t-chart on this because that fourth power is twice as big as the second power. Remember, t-chart, we're thinking about what's multiplying to 1 and adding to negative 2. Well, that would be negative 1 times negative 1 and negative 1 plus negative 1. So we're going to use that same principle when we factor our cosine. So we're going to start by factoring it as cosine squared minus 1 and cosine squared minus 1. So what we really have is cosine squared minus 1 squared. But using our Pythagorean identity, this is sine squared. Sine squared equals cosine squared minus 1. And so when we square that, we get sine to the fourth. This one, our problem is that we have cosecant and cotangent in the same expression. And before we can factor it, we want the same trig function. So this is one of those Pythagorean identities, but we need to rewrite it. We have cosecant squared, but we want to rewrite it in terms of cotangent. So we're going to substitute cotangent squared plus 1 for our cosecant squared. So this becomes cotangent squared plus 1. All of this is replacing the cosecant squared. And then we still have our minus cotangent minus 3. So when I combine my like terms and putting it in standard form, I have cotangent squared minus cotangent, and that plus 1 minus 3 becomes a minus 2. So now I can use my t-chart. What multiplies to negative 2 adds to negative 1. So we have cotangent minus 2, cotangent plus 1. And our last one, I'm sure you're excited that this is our last one. I know that factoring with trig is much more challenging than factoring in general, so we can spend a lot of time during our warm-up or going over a couple of questions on the assignment together if we need to. This one is a factoring by grouping. So notice my first two terms both have a cosecant squared. So I'm left with cosecant minus 1. These two terms, I want it to match what I've got in my other set of parentheses. So I'm going to factor out a negative 1, and I'll be left with cosecant minus 1. Now I'm going to factor out that cosecant x minus 1, and I'm left with cosecant squared minus 1. But we recognize this as one of the Pythagorean identities. So I'm going to put this in front. Cosecant squared minus 1 is the same as cotangent squared times cosecant minus 1. Here's your you try question. This is, as a hint, one of the AC method, and then you'll have to factor by grouping.